Go for it. Greetings. Let me just say, welcome everyone. We've got a couple more people coming. Um, we are happy that there are no storms on the weather report this evening. Glad that you are all safe. For anyone who missed last week, Jennifer McCaig sent out the recording, which had a lot of blackened screens as people were in their basements, I think. But great welcome. Malka, welcome back. Thank you so much. Some of you saw or got to talk to Malka last night as she was at the Bernadine lecture in the Pearlman Sanctuary at North Shore. So good to see you 2 nights in a row. Thanks.
Yeah, it was fantastic to be at North Shore last night and hear the wonderful lecture and also meet some of you in person. So I was really glad to join you. And I'm just going to invite you to access the source sheet that should have been sent to you, but I will also share
It
my.
wasn't. Yeah.
Oh no.
No, it was sent. It was sent.
Oh, I thought you said it wasn't. Okay.
No, it was sent, and I'm just gonna pull it up if anyone doesn't have it. So give me a
Okay, well, I'm
second.
also going to share it.
Okay, but it was definitely sent with the recording of last week's class.
Perfect. Okay, all right. So as you know, our first class explored what scholars call common Judaism. And these are the practices that united Jews wherever they lived throughout the Hellenistic world, both in Greek and Roman times. And these practices were Shabbat/holidays, so different calendar, circumcision, dietary laws. And then I also suggested that the role of the Torah, or role of Torah without the article the, was extremely central to Jews. And Torah with a lowercase t, an uppercase t, with the in front of it or no the, but the concept of an expansive set of teachings that were not yet canonical, but definitely authoritative and ancient, really set the Jews apart. And the fact that as soon as Jews are gathering to regularly read these texts, they're also interpreting them. And so you have evolving and developing an interpretive tradition that becomes known as the unwritten law. That's what Philo of Alexandria calls it. That's what Josephus calls it. And this unwritten law becomes central to the sectarian debates between different various groups, the Pharisees who say this is authoritative and the Sadducees who reject the notion of unwritten law. But when the temple falls in 70 CE and the Sadducees are out of a job and the Pharisees find themselves desperately needed because the people now don't have a temple, but they need another way to connect to God. So they look to the Pharisees to teach them their scriptures. The Pharisees now assert their long-standing claim that there is an unwritten law or an oral law and a written law or a written Torah. And so the notions that you have written Torah and unwritten Torah is actually pre-rabbinic. You see seeds of this planted in as early as the 4th or 3rd century BCE. So class 1, we discussed common Judaism, what kept Jews throughout the ancient world together. Last week, we discussed what outsiders were saying about Jews, and Jews in the widest, most general sense, even though they were disparate and they were living under different cultural influences. But we did see patterns about what outsiders said about these Jews. They're insular, they have too much power, they cause division, they take but they don't give, they're misanthropic, they're barbaric, and of course money. They have too much money and they only direct it towards their own needs. So tonight we're going to peek under the hood a little bit and look inside the world of Jewish life. So we kind of did a high-level examination of what kept Jews together in class 1. Then we looked at outsiders in class 2. But what was really going on that distinguished Jews from one another inside the Jewish world? So that's what we're going to explore tonight. And the reason why we're going to move on to that is because Jews, especially Jews living in the land of Israel, we're not necessarily extremely concerned with anti-Jewish literature. We don't have a lot of literature produced by Jews in the Hellenistic era that is overtly polemical. until we get to the first century. And then we have figures like Josephus in the late first century who writes against Appian, which, as I said 2 weeks ago, is the first systemic defense of the Jewish religion against those who critique its validity and its integrity. But earlier in the third and second and even first centuries BCE, most of what Jews are producing is not overtly polemical or addressing non-Jews, but we have a lot of literature that is produced by Jews for Jews. And so I want to look at the intra-Jewish relationship tonight and focus on Judea-diaspora relations. And tonight we're actually going to focus on the perspective of Judean Jews, those Jews who lived in the land of Israel. Next week, we'll look at how Jews in the diaspora related to both non-Jewish critiques of Judaism and to Judean critiques of diaspora and Jewry. So just so we're not too confused here, diaspora and Jews is where we're going to land next week. And these Jews are doubly marginalized. They are being told by their Egyptian and Greek and Roman neighbors that they do not belong, right? Because they're celebrating different holidays, they're on a different calendar, they don't participate in public festivals to the gods, so they don't belong. And they're also being told, as we will see tonight, by Judean Jews that they are not fully authentic or not practicing in exactly the right way. So they are receiving messages from two different directions, but at the core is a single argument, and that is your loyalties are going to the wrong place. Greeks and Romans are saying to diaspora and Jews, your loyalties to Jerusalem, and that's a problem. You need to be loyal to Rome, or you need to be loyal to the Greek Empire. And Jews in the land of Israel are saying, you're not sufficiently loyal to Jerusalem. You're too loyal to your host empire, your host ruler, wherever you live in Antioch or Alexandria or Rome. So these diasporan Jews find themselves to be doubly marginalized. And again, we'll look next week at how they respond to these accusations. But tonight we're going to focus on Judean literature that's directed to diaspora and Jewry. And we're going to start from the vantage point of what I think is the most single pressing theological question in the ancient world. And that question, I can't remember if I discussed this 2 weeks ago, because I was in Oklahoma, I was in Philadelphia, I'm teaching at CTU, so I feel bad if I'm repeating myself, but the most important theological question in the ancient world is the exile over? This is the question that Jews cannot agree on. And it's a huge question because there's a lot at stake. We need to know what our standing is with God. And it's not at all clear. Because on the one hand, in 538 BCE, Cyrus, the Persian king, says to the Judeans in what was once Babylonia, now it's Persia, he says you can go back to the land of Israel and rebuild their temple. And they do. And they rebuild their temple by 515 BCE. So you might say, well, seems to me that the exile is over. Look, the Jews came back. They rebuilt their second temple. Now we're moving on. We're in a different period. We're in the second temple period. But you could also say, no, there are two things that are required to put a complete and unequivocal end to the Babylonian exile. One is rebuilding the temple. Two is the ingathering of all the Judeans in their dispersion back to the land of Israel. Those were the two signs that the prophets guaranteed would happen after the exile came to an end. So if you read Jeremiah or you read the prophets from the period of exile, they promise the exile will end, you'll rebuild your temple, and everybody will come back. Well, what happens by 500 BC? It's very clear that the majority of Jews are not coming back. I remember I did speak a little bit about this 2 weeks ago. And so you have a debate. Is the exile over? Now, diasporan Jews will say, yes, the exile is over. What's the evidence? Look at how great we're doing. We're here in Alexandria. Well, Alexandria is 3rd century BCE, but we're here in Persia. We're here living across all these coastal Mediterranean lands. We're making a living. We're worshiping our ancestral laws. You got your temple in Jerusalem. We'll send you a check once every month. Yes, the exile is over. Things are great. And the Jews in the land of Israel say, no, the exile is not over, and it's your fault. Because now that you can make the choice to return to the land of Israel and you stay put, boy, is God angry. And the only way that you can really put an end to the period of the exile is by coming back. So this is the big debate. And if it sounds contemporary or resonant, then it sounds contemporary and resonant to me too. But we have a lot of literature that addresses this question. What's going to be in this obvious reality that we are not going to have an ingathering? Now, yes, maybe down the road, the Messiah will come and miraculously usher everybody in back to the homeland. But on a practical level, it becomes very clear that Jews are not going to make the choice on their own to come back. So what's a Jerusalemite Judean to do? Do you just sort of revise your theology and say, all right, this is what we're doing now. I guess we have to accept this and presumably assume that, God is fine with it too, because those Jews outside the land of Israel are doing pretty well. Well, in fact, that is not what Judean Jews do. They implore their kin in the diaspora to accept the notion of Judean exceptionalism. So even though they don't fantasize that all the Jews in the diaspora are going to pack up their bags tomorrow and go to Jerusalem, go to the land of Israel, but they really want, at minimum, Jews in the diaspora to show their loyalty, their primary loyalty to Jerusalem and the land of Israel. We have some really interesting evidence that I want to go through with you tonight. And we'll start with Elephantine. So if everybody has the source sheet, I'm not going to share it, but it looks like Bob has a question. Does Bob have a question? Because he's on mute. I don't know, maybe you can't unmute yourself, but I'm not a host, so I can't unmute you.
Good.
Okay.
So at this point, the exile is what, only 50 years, right? The first, the Babylonian was 50 years, and then Cyrus has come back.
It's right, so, 586 to 538. Yeah.
And so before that, all the Jews essentially were in Israel, or
right,
Judea or whatever, and then 50, and all of them left, and how many came back?
So this is a great question. So scholars, first of all, such as Oded Lipschitz, who I think is at Tel Aviv University or maybe Hebrew U, but Oded Lipschitz has done a lot of work on this, and others. First of all, scholars are now suggesting that not all Judahites in the early 6th century BCE did leave the land. That there was an exile, but the extent to which it was a complete exile, they don't know. I think that this is a little bit of a problematic stance because it's very speculative and there's a lot of ideology at stake in these scholarly opinions. But I should just say that there are many scholars who will say, we don't know that every single Judahite was exiled. So when the Judahites who were exiled come back to the land, they're clashing with the Judahites who never left. And so there are some debates that we find in Ezra and Nehemiah. And so maybe the sort of the foundation of those debates is that some Judahites never left. That's one. Two, Ezra chapter 2 lists the names of now we say Judeans, and Judahites are Judeans, lists the names of the Judeans who came back at the end of exile, and let's say the end of the 6th century BC, and he puts that number at 43,000, which is a tiny percentage of whatever population would have been in exile. Let's say 500,000. I mean, we really don't have the numbers, but it's clear that 43,000 is a very, very, very low number. So by the 5th or 4th century BCE, you could have a couple 100,000 Judeans in the land of Israel and even more outside of it. That's the reality. I mean, so it's quite confusing. But again, very few Judeans go back to the land of Israel. And the other ones either stay in Persia or they migrate around. And then you also have the Judeans who never left. So it's not a binary, it's a complicated picture. Is that helpful?
And was the thought that the people who did not come back were somehow less religious to begin with, or less, like the Reformed Jews in the United States and the Orthodox Jews in Israel? I mean, was it
I very much push back against that in my work. I find that to be an assumption that people make, and I find it to have no bearing in the evidence. We know from much of the diasporan literature, and we'll look at this next week, that Jews outside the land of Israel were assiduously observing their common Judaism. So it's not a sectarian form of Judaism. We don't really have evidence of sectarian practice outside the land of Israel, but we have common Judaism. That's why I started the series emphasizing common Judaism, because we know that Jews outside the land of Israel at a very early stage are keeping distinctive holidays, dietary practices, and circumcision. And that's uniting them wherever they do it. However, we have Judean texts. So when I say Judean in this sentence, I mean we have texts from Judea, from the land of Israel, that portray diasporan Judaism as inauthentic. And that's a polemic. So we have to be careful when we read these texts. Does it actually mean that Jews outside the land of Israel were less religious or were inauthentic? No. But these are texts that want to make an argument that they are. And this is the dynamic that we're going to explore.
Thank you.
So yeah, and I always say to my students, there's no binary, there's no correlation between your geographic stance and your religious position. Just like today, you have Jews in Tel Aviv who are eating shrimp on the beach, and you have Jews in upstate New York who are speaking Yiddish. Well, so it was in the ancient world. And also no correlation between the language that you spoke and your level of religiosity. You had Greek-speaking Jews in Alexandria who were carefully observing their ancestral law. And you had Jews speaking Hebrew in the land of Israel who were Hellenized, and we know this from the books of Maccabees. So we have to be nuanced, even if the text that we read tonight might not be so nuanced because they're polemical documents. So let's dive in. So I'm going to start at the end of the 5th century BCE. This is actually a very dark period. We know very, very little about Jewish life under Persian rule. The Second Temple period, I think I discussed 2 weeks ago, is divided into 4 parts. We've got the Persian period from 515 BCE to 323 BCE. Then we have the Hellenistic era from 323, when Alexander the Great conquers the Persian world, until 164, when the Hasmoneans rebel against the Greeks. And I could say more about, there were different kinds of Greeks. There were Syrian Greeks, Antiochian Greeks. I'm not going to go on a tangent now, even though I'd love to say more about that if you want in the Q&A. But from 323 to 164 BCE, we have Jews living under Hellenism, either under Ptolemaic Hellenism in Egypt or Seleucid Hellenism in land of Israel. And so they're different, or Antiochid Greeks to the east. But in 164 BCE, the Hasmoneans achieve independence, and then we have 100 years of the Hasmonean monarchy until 63 BC, and then we have the Romans who incorporate Judea into their empire. So we've got 4 sections. Now we know very little, or we know the least amount of all these sections. We know the least amount about that early period of Jewish life under Persian rule. But we do know about a tiny little Jewish settlement on an island in the Nile River called Elephantine. Has anybody heard of Elephantine? Yeah, okay, all right, so we got some takers. Okay, so Chuck knows. So in 1907, there were some archaeological digs dug in various places in Egypt, and there was a cache of papyri that was discovered on this island in Upper Egypt. And I think it's Upper Egypt, or now I'd have to double check. I'm pretty sure it is. And Elephantine was a place where the Persians, who were fighting their bitter enemies, the Egyptians, in the 6th and 5th century BCE, they stationed a military garrison, and one of those garrisons was an Elephantine, and that garrison was comprised primarily of Judeans. So presumably these Judeans had come from eastern lands where their ancestors had been exiled, and at some point in the 6th century, or probably more like the 5th century BC. They're sent by Persia to Egypt, and some of them settle on this island. So we have this cache of papyri, and mostly it's quite mundane. These are papyri that are, they contain marriage contracts, they contain business documents, mostly, financial archival material. But there are some letters in the Elephantine papyri, written in Aramaic, to Judeans in the land of Israel. And some of these are extremely fascinating. And I want to home in on one. Not going to share my screen because I like to see all of you. But if you are having trouble finding the place, then I'm happy to share my screen. But we're not actually going to do the source so much inside. But here's the scenario. Now, as you scan the opening lines of this letter, you'll notice that the people writing, they live in Elephantine. They're writing an Aramaic letter, and they have Hebrew names. So these are clearly Judeans. These are people who come from the region of the land of Israel. And they're writing to the Persian governor of Judah, which the Persians called Yehud. Remember I said this 2 weeks ago, that when the Persians conquered this region from Babylonia, they renamed Yehuda, they called it Yehud. And so a Jew or it's confusing. Sometimes I say Judean and I mean a person from the land of Israel, and sometimes I say Judean and I mean someone living in the land of Israel. So I'm going to say Jew, even though scholars are very snobby and they don't like to say the word Jew before the 2nd century BC, but I'm going to say Jew for purposes of clarity. So a Jew living in Elephantine named Yedanya writes a letter to the Persian governor of Yehud in Jerusalem. And the name of that Persian governor is Bagavachya. And we have this letter where he says, listen, Bagavachya, we're in big trouble. We need your help. Something terrible has happened to the Jews of Elephantine. Our neighbors, the Egyptian priests of Chnum, well, here you see Chnug, but sometimes they're called Chnum. That's in the 2nd paragraph over here. Our neighbors, with their leader, that terrible guy, Vidranga, that Egyptian priest Vidranga at the helm, have vandalized our temple to the god Yud He Vav, the god whose name is also is the Tetragrammaton, right? I don't say it out loud, but scholars will say Yahweh, which I think is a horrible pronunciation. But in any case, we have a reference to the Jewish god spelled Yud He Vav, and so we worship our ancestral god, and we have a temple, a Jewish temple in Elephantine, and the Egyptian priests have vandalized it. Now, Bagavachya, we need your help because we need official permission from leaders in Jerusalem to rebuild our temple. Now, this is bizarre for many reasons. You could just scan through the letter. This is really, really strange. Why would Yedanya need to send a letter to leaders in Jerusalem for permission to rebuild their temple when you have Persian officials who are in Egypt or much closer proximity to Elephantine? Why is Yedanya writing to the governor of Yehud? I want you to put that question on the back burner because I think you'll find some answers in the response that Yedanya gets. But if you just look through this letter, it's really interesting how he describes the response to the destruction of this temple. So if you look at the, I think 1, 2, 3, the 4th paragraph, when this had been done to us, we and our wives and children, we were sackcloth we were wearing, and we were fasting and we were praying. Do you see that? To the Lord of heaven. And then Vidranga got punished. Vidranga was chastised by local authorities, and thank God he was killed. Hooray. But we still need your permission to rebuild the temple. So he says, if to our Lord this is good, take thought of that temple to rebuild it, since I guess local authorities don't want us to rebuild it. So we need an official letter from you that says that you're okay with this. And if you go to the third line from the bottom, about this, we've already sent you a letter, and apparently they hadn't responded to the first letter. And all these things we already put in our name to someone named Deliah, and another person named Shelemiah, the sons of Sanballat, a governor in Samaria who's actually mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. And then we have this dated. It's dated to 407 BC, and which is just an unbelievable thing that in 1907 there was a document discovered that had been laid, totally untouched since 407 BC. I mean, it's just unbelievable. Anyway, not only do we have this letter of Yedanya writing to Bhagavacha and his companions in Jerusalem asking for permission to rebuild the temple, but we actually have a copy of the response. And the response is fascinating. But before I get there, I want to clarify. One thing that's really intriguing about Yedanya's letter is the total lack of, I would say, self-consciousness that there is a Jewish temple outside of Jerusalem. Right? I mean, just thinking about this is really a shock. You read Deuteronomy and you read so much of the Hebrew Bible, and the notion of temples outside of Jerusalem is totally anathema, right? I mean, that's basically the reason why the northern Israelite kingdom is exiled by Assyria in 722 BC, because the Israelites are worshiping the wrong places, and the question of where to worship is such a hot topic among the biblical prophets. And here we have a Jewish temple in Elephantine, and Yedanya totally takes it for granted that this is like acceptable, and he takes pride in it and thinks that it should be rebuilt so that the Jews who are local to this temple can continue to worship their ancestral god at its altars. Very, very surprising, I think, for modern readers. But take a look at what Bhagavacha says in response. He says, oh, well, I have to scroll up, because what he's asking for, he asks in the last big paragraph, he says, this is what we want to do. We want to bring the meal offering and the incense and the burnt offerings. So we want to, it should function almost exactly like the Jerusalem temple. So Bhagavacha says, all right, okay, we're fine with this. Let it be for you in Egypt to say there's some corruption in the text. Again, they were like lying dormant for 2,000 years. So, we'll be understanding. But then he says, regarding this temple, we give you permission to rebuild it on its site as it was formerly, and the meal offering and the incense they shall offer upon that altar, just as formerly was done. What is missing in Bhagavacha's response? Look very carefully. Bhagavacha says, you can bring the meal offering and you can bring the incense on your temple that you rebuilt. There's something that he's not including. You have to go back to the original request of Yedanya. And can you see what Yedanya asks for in that last big paragraph that's not in Bhagavacha's response? It's okay. It's not a test. I'll just tell you. So Bhagavacha, so Yedanya says, I want to bring the meal offering and the incense and the burnt offering. Now the burnt offering is the thing, right? That's sacrificing animals. The meal offering is flour and the incense is spices, but the burnt offering is like the central act of worship. And it's not in Bhagavacha's response. No burnt offering for you. Okay. All right. Don't get ahead of yourselves. You're not priests in the Jerusalem temple. You want to bring some flour. You want to put on an altar that you built. Put some flour on that altar. You want to put some incense there. Gesundheit. Do it. They didn't say Gesundheit, but you're not bringing burnt offerings at your temple, right? Because it's the act of the burnt offerings that were, according to tradition, at least in the first temple, miraculously accepted by God, consumed by, I don't know how this worked. Was it divine fire? But it was, consumed by the priests and by the people, depending on which sacrifice it was. And all of that was really the main sign that God accepted the sacrifice and had forgiven the people of their sins. So none of that was going to happen at the Elephantine temple. Why does Bhagavacha skip the burnt offerings? What is he presumably saying ever so subtly to Yedanya?
Wrong God?
Well, so I don't know, because they do say, they do identify the God as the God that's named in the Hebrew Bible with the same letters. I mean, Yeho instead of Yeho, yeah, but it's very much, you know, Yud Hey Vav. So it seems to be the same God. We also have something from Elephantine called the Passover letter, where Yedanya writes to authorities in Jerusalem about the proper observance of Passover. So, I mean, these things are extraordinarily early. We have nothing else like this. This puts the Dead Sea Scrolls to shame. The Dead Sea Scrolls are from the 1st century BCE, and this is, 300 years earlier. So what I think,
Still
hold on.
doing the sacrifices in Israel?
Hold on 1 second. Why would they need that from? Let's try not to use the chat, because let's just keep it a conversation. Then we can use the chat maybe at the end. Sorry, say that one more time.
Were they still doing sacrifices in Israel?
Yeah, because this was the early Second Temple period. So the Second Temple period is from 515 BCE to 70 CE, and this is early on in the Second Temple period. This is 407 BCE.
So was he legitimizing their temple by doing that?
100%. The point here is that you could build a temple, if that's what you want to do, you could put an altar in the temple, but you're not offering animal sacrifices at that temple. There's only one real Jerusalem temple, or not sure. There's only one real Jewish temple, and that's the one in Jerusalem. So lest you get the wrong idea and think that those two temples are substitutions for one another, Bhagavachya and his colleagues in Jerusalem set them straight. Now, scholars don't know if Bhagavachya was Jewish. He has a Persian name, but look at what the scribe adds in this response. What Bhagavachya and Delaiah said to me. Delaiah, that's a Jewish name. Delaiah, any name in the ancient world that has this Yud Hey at the end, Delaiah, it would be more of a Semitic origin than Bhagavachya. So scholars think Bhagavachya consulted with his companion, his colleague, his coworker, who was of Judean ancestry, and said, what do I do here? I have no idea what I should say to these people in Elephantine. Delaiah says, you got to put the kibosh on this. Let them bring incense and meal offering, but they can't bring animal sacrifices. Now, there is one other possibility, but I really want to get to the other letters. The other possibility, which I just sent in my book proofs. My book is coming out in June, and I have a big chapter on this. And I just sent in the final proofs. And then literally the week after I sent in the proofs, it's totally done, I found a completely different reason for why Bhagavachya would have said no animal sacrifices. And then I felt like an idiot. And now someone's going to review my book and be like, how did she not say this? So I'm sharing my angst with you. The other possibility is that Egyptians worshipped the ram god. They worshipped the ram, and they found it profoundly offensive that one of the main animals that were sacrificed on the Jewish temples, whether in Jerusalem or in Elephantine, were sheep and goats and rams. And so that was considered an offense. So it could be that Bhagavachya is saying, listen, you don't want your temple to be desecrated? Maybe stop offending them by sacrificing their god. Have you ever thought of that? So that's compelling too. And it's not in my book. But in any case, I do think that there are seeds here of Judean exceptionalism. The very fact that Yedanya is reaching out to Bhagavachya and saying, listen, I'm not ashamed of our temple, but I recognize that our cultic authority derives from Jerusalem. And so we want your blessing on this, because we want you to know that our temple, it pays homage to yours in Jerusalem and doesn't undermine it, but imitates it in respect. And so by reaching out to Bhagavachya, that's a sign of sort of submission to the authority of Jerusalem leaders. I want to move on to two extraordinary letters written by other leaders in Jerusalem associated with the temple a few hundred years later, 200 years later, actually 300 years later. But any questions on Elephantine before we move on to those letters? And sadly, we have to skip Tobit. I'm not going to finish at 8, but I'm going to try to finish by 8:10.
You can go longer.
Yeah, I mean, I taught for 3 hours today from 1 to 4, so I don't know if I can go longer, but I'm gonna. We'll see. And I don't know. You're all, I'm sure, also tired, but let's skip Tobit. Tobit is a 3rd century BCE document. It's a novella written in the late 3rd century. I just said that, BC in the land of Israel. And Tobit, it's a fascinating story, but he introduces himself at the beginning of the work by bragging about how he's so devoted to the temple and he gives his tithes and he's always giving food to the priests. And then at the very end of the novella, there's a kind of apocalyptic prediction that Tobit gives on his deathbed, where he imagines an ingathering of all the exiles. So Tobit, again, written by a Jew in the land of Israel in Hebrew in the 3rd century BC, is fantasizing about this ingathering that had actually not happened. But I think that it does speak to this Judean longing for the diaspora in return that just wasn't happening. And they were like, why aren't you coming back? Here we are. We've got this great country and God wants you here. And what are you doing out there? So Tobit speaks to that longing. So does Ben Sira. Maybe if we have time, I could speak more about Tobit and Ben Sira, but I really want to get to the letters in 2 Maccabees. So this is where we're going to focus because these are just absolutely delightful. All right. I'm gathering my strength to say some very exciting things. Hold on. Okay. And I'm getting comfortable. And you should all too. In the early 1st century BCE, a scribe, probably working in the land of Israel, who was copying over a book that we know today as 2 Maccabees, had letters in his possession from leaders in Jerusalem to Jews in Egypt. And rather than just copying the book of 2 Maccabees onto another scroll, this scribe said, I have these letters that thematically connect with the book of 2 Maccabees. So I'm going to open up the scroll with these letters. And the only reason why we have these letters today is because they're appended to the work known as 2 Maccabees. 2 Maccabees is an account of the Hasmonean rebellion against the Syrian Greeks that took place from 175 to 164 BCE. 2 Maccabees is, I'm just going to say this very unprofessionally, it's a little bit of a bonkers text. It is not written by an eyewitness to the Hasmonean rebellion. It is written in gorgeous Greek. It is highly theological. It has almost no interest in the Hasmonean family. It is rife with miracles. And it is the first book that we know of in all of Jewish literature and all of our history to use the word Judaism. It is a very important work theologically. In a way, it's more important than 1 Maccabees. It's one of the first texts to explicitly assert the belief in resurrection. And there are many, many firsts in 2 Maccabees. It's a hugely important text. It's written in Cyrene in modern-day Libya. That's 2 Maccabees. 1 Maccabees is a very technical account of the Hasmonean War, written by an eyewitness to the account, probably somebody who worked for the Hasmonean court. This would have been commissioned by the court to produce an official account of the war. And 1 Maccabees is, it does have poetry and it does have some pathos, but it is also much more technical, much more accurate, and less, I would say, theologically inclined. So these are very different books. Now, scholars say today, oh, how do you know about the story of Hanukkah? 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees and Josephus. But 1 Maccabees and 2 Maccabees could not be more different. Again, 1 Maccabees written in the land of Israel, in Hebrew, by someone who worked for the Hasmonean family, highlighting the heroics of the Hasmoneans. 2 Maccabees has almost no interest in the Hasmoneans, written in Greek. It's a very theological work. Fine. So we have this book, 2 Maccabees. I'm not going to actually talk about 2 Maccabees. I'm going to talk about the letters appended to it. You can open up 2 Maccabees. You could see it online. There are all kinds of translations. Most of them are pretty bad because you can only get the old translations for free. But you would notice that the book starts in chapter 2, verse 18. Chapter 1, verse 1 to verse 10 is a letter. And then the second letter is chapter 1, verse 10 to chapter 2, verse 18. So we've got these 2 letters. People just read the book. They don't even realize that they're reading different documents that were written by different people. So what are these letters? These letters are exhortations written by Jews in Jerusalem to Jews in Egypt. And they have a very, very clear and concrete request. please celebrate Hanukkah. Just keep Hanukkah. Now, we don't have the word Hanukkah because that word doesn't show up until the rabbinic period. This holiday is so new, it doesn't even have a name. In fact, Jews are arguing about what to call this holiday. So we'll see in our letters that the names that they have for this holiday are very clunky. One writer calls it the Feast of Tabernacles in Kislev, which, as you can imagine, did not catch on. Other writers call it the Purification. Josephus in the late 1st century will say, ooh, we call it lights, but I don't know why. And then he says, oh, I think it's because things were dark and then things got really good. And you're just reading this and you're like, Josephus, that's literally every Jewish holiday. But the fact that Josephus at the end of the 1st century is like, we call it lights, I don't know, tells you that, first of all, by the late 1st century, it was already an ancient name for the holiday, right? Because if he doesn't know why, then it's got to be at least 4 or 5 generations old. But also, when you have many different names for something, it means that you're debating its theological significance. And Hanukkah was absolutely debated. Now, the big question with Hanukkah is, this is the first time in our history that something really big has happened to us, and we weren't all there, right? We were all slaves in Egypt. We were all redeemed. We were all at Sinai. We all went through the desert. So the pilgrimage holidays make sense. Everybody, everyone has ancestors. All Jews, I mean, even converts, the later rabbis will say, have this historic legacy in these stories. But what do you do with a war that takes place in the 170s and 160s BCE when the majority of Jews are no longer living in the land of Israel? So many Jews outside the land of Israel are saying, great, we're really happy this happened for you. You creamed the Greeks. You beat them. That is super. But we're not going to celebrate it for perpetuity every year. I mean, who has the authority to decide that? So the question of whether Hanukkah has theological significance for every Jew is a huge, huge question in the 2nd century BCE. And the diasporan author of 2 Maccabees theologizes the story to make the argument that every single Jew should care very deeply about what happened and celebrate the holiday. So the book 2 Maccabees is saying, this is a theological work. What's the message of the war? That God cares about every single Jew. Now we're going to see that these letters put a twist on that. God cares especially about those Jews who return to the land of Israel. Now these are quite complicated. So I appreciate your patience that we might go a little bit later than usual tonight to take a real good look at these and really understand the polemic that's being developed as Jews in Jerusalem reach out to their kin living in Egypt. And you have to remember that by the time these letters are written in the late 2nd century BCE, there are up to 1 million Jews in Egypt. There might be more Jews in Egypt than in the land of Israel. There are hundreds of thousands of Jews just in Alexandria alone. So this is a huge threat to Jews in Jerusalem because they're so close and they're not coming back and they're doing quite well. Now, I think if it's okay with you, I will share my screen, even though I really hate doing that, but I'm going to do it. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Okay. Here we go. Oh, no, I'm not a host. Rabbi Green, do you mind making me? Okay.
I'm getting you there. I thought you were on. I thought you were. Hang on.
Problem.
Second. You're on.
Thank you so much. All right. Okay, so now I have to make sure that I have the right, let's see. Okay. Oh no, you probably see my notes. No, this is, okay, do you see 2 Maccabees? All right, good. All right, letter number 1. I didn't discuss this with you 2 weeks ago, right? Because I'm having so much deja vu. I feel like all I do is talk about these letters these days. Okay.
Yeah.
Jews in Jerusalem and those in the land of Judea. This is a letter preserved in Greek, but the Semiticisms in the letter tell us that it was written in Aramaic or Hebrew. When you reverse translate this letter into Hebrew, it reads very smoothly. So there's scholarly consensus. This was written in Hebrew and then shortly afterwards translated into Greek, and we only have it in the Greek today. Okay. The Jews in Jerusalem and those in the land of Judea. So all Jews in the land of Judea, to their Jewish kindred in Egypt, greetings and true peace. Shalom tov, right? That would sound normal in Hebrew. Now we have this very long prayer. It's long, well, the letter's short, but it's long. It's unusual to have 50% of a letter just be a prayer or a blessing. So it's disproportionate over here. The rest of this paragraph is all a blessing. May God do good to you, and may God remember his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, his faithful servants. May God give you all a heart to worship him and to do his will with a strong heart and a willing spirit. May God open your heart to his law and commandments. And here the law in Greek is nomos, but in Hebrew that would have been Torah. So it's not, law isn't really a good translation. Really, it's just be may open his heart to his Torah and his mitzvot, right? That's sounds much better than law, commandments. But may God open your heart to God's Torah. May God bring peace. Now, you tell me, what does it suggest when someone says, may God open your heart, right? What's the implication here? Is that their hearts are
Closed.
closed, right? And so it's like saying to someone, I'm really bad with analogies, but it's like saying, wow, I wish for you that you were just so smart. I wish you were, may God make you intelligent, right? Like you're thinking like, what? I don't know. I thought I was fine. I thought I was like reasonably like, okay. But you can imagine Jews receiving this in Alexandria and being like, give us a heart to worship him. I mean, I kind of thought we were already doing that. May God open your heart to his law and his commandments. May God bring peace. And they're like, I thought things were pretty okay here in Alexandria. May God hear your prayers and be reconciled to you. And may God not forsake you in times of evil. We are now praying for you here. Right? So just kind of paternalism, this kind of concern that's being conveyed. But this is a dated text. This is a text that's dated to 124 BC. Again, it's very rare to have a dated text. This text is dated. And in 124 BCE, there's a lot more going on in the land of Israel than in Alexandria. Now, there were some hiccups in Alexandria with various civil wars that were taking place between various claimants to the throne. It's all coming out of my book in June, but there was a lot more upheaval in Judea. And so for Judean authorities to send a letter to Jews in Egypt and say, we're so concerned about your state of spirituality and we're praying for you, would have been a surprise, I think, to Egyptian Jews who are receiving this and being like, what? Thought things were fine. So already there's an implication here that there's a problem. And now here's the actual letter. Okay, that is like the very long blessing. In the reign of Demetrius in the 169th year, we Jews wrote to you. How are they counting? Anybody know? Anyone know how what is 169? I mean, they're obviously not going down, right? They're not counting to the year 1. They're counting from the beginning of the Seleucid Empire, from 312 or 311 BCE. Alexander the Great dies in 323 BCE, and then there's a lot of upheaval, and then the Seleucids sort of assert their authority in 312, 311, so they're counting down from there. So that puts this year in around 140, 142 BCE. So we wrote to you in 142 BC in the critical distress that came upon us in those years after Jason, that Hellenized Jew who let the Greeks come in and violate the temple. Jason revolted from the Holy Land and the kingdom, and he burned the gate and he shed innocent blood. So we have this. Has anyone heard of Jason? He's one of the famous Hellenized Jews in the 160s BC who was blamed for allowing the Hellenization of Jerusalem to sort of make the more traditional Jews vulnerable to the enemy Greeks. So when Antiochus IV Epiphanes said to the Jews in the land of Israel, you can't observe your ancestral law, Jason was a Jew who said, great, let's not. And then you had both a civil clash where Jews were fighting Jews, and you also had that broader clash where Jews were fighting the Syrian Greeks. So Jason was a Hellenized Jew. So we told you in the 140s BCE the whole story about Hanukkah. Now they don't say Hanukkah, but we told you the whole story about Jason. And we told you about how we prayed to the Lord and we were heard. And we offered sacrifice and grain offerings and we lit the lamps. right? So at 164 BC, we gained control of the temple again, and we kicked out the Greeks, and we got independence. We told you the whole story. So, see that you keep the festival of booths in the month of Kislev in the 188th year. This is a remarkable text. What is the 188th year? So again, we're counting down from the Seleucid Empire, so it's like 123 BCE. So we have 3 generations in this little letter. We have the generation of the Hasmonean rebels. We have a generation of Jews in the 140s who, I almost said emails, it's been a long day, who writes to the Jews in Alexandria and tells them everything that happened in the 140s, right? In the reign of Demetrius, in the 169th years, we wrote to you and we told you everything. And now see that you keep the festival of booths and then they sign it in the 180th year. So this letter is written in the 120s. It's referencing a letter that Jerusalem Jews sent to Egyptian Jews in the 140s. And it's saying in the 140s, 20 years ago, we told you what happened in the 160s. So this is the 3rd generation of Jews to have experienced or to be remembering the Hasmonean rebellion. Okay, so it's a little confusing, right? But here's the bottom line. Jews in Jerusalem in the 120s are like, oh my God, it's been 40 years and you're still not keeping this holiday, right? You're still not understanding that this is something in which you have a personal stake. That the miraculous defeat of the Hasmoneans over the Syrian Greeks in Jerusalem and Judea is a story that impacts you. And that every Jew, wherever they live, should be observing the festival of booths in the month of Kislev. And so it must be that the letter that was sent in the 140s BCE fell on deaf ears, right? It was sent to Jews in Egypt, and they said, all right, okay, Jason, all right, they burned the gate, they shed innocent blood, they were prayed to the Lord, they were good, all right, good for them, we're happy, and they went about their lives. 20 years later, the Jews in Jerusalem see, it still has not caught on, they write another letter. But see how they collapse their identities? We are writing to you now. We wrote to you 20 years ago. And this happened to us 40 years ago, right? Now, probably these are all different Jews. The Jews who experienced the rebellion are not the Jews who wrote the letter 20 years later, or not the Jews who are now again trying to convince their kin to keep Hanukkah. But there's a sense of like, we, the Judean Jews, are coming to you, right? And so if you look at the beginning of the letter, we beseech you as Judeans to recognize the theological significance of the defeat over Syrian Greeks. So on the one hand, there's Judean exceptionalism, and there is authority that comes from the Jerusalem leadership. On the other hand, there's an argument that we are all united in a common destiny, and what happens here to us impacts you. But more than anything, this letter proves that diasporan Jews were not really buying it. At least not yet. It takes some time for this holiday to catch on. Why did they need 2 holidays of tabernacles, one in Tishrei and one in Kislev? They might have asked. Isn't one enough? That's why they had to remarket it. They needed a marketing team to say, all right, maybe we won't call it that. We'll call it something else. All right, any questions? Oh my gosh, it's already 7:55. I don't know how much I should dive into the next letter because it is very complicated, but I really want to because it's very fun. Any questions on this first letter? No questions. Wait, actually,
Judy
Yeah.
Soap. Judy? Do you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask, who wrote this letter? I mean, was it, you say the Jews in Jerusalem, but is this something that was written by their priests or by a group of people that sat down and wrote it? How did it get done?
don't know. Probably these were not priests, but Jews that maybe were associated with Pharisees. We really don't know. We don't know. Jews who were absolutely opposed to the Hellenized Jews, such as Jason, but we don't have their names. They must have had some local political authority because they are presenting themselves as representatives of all the Jews in the land. And we have another letter just like it, which is a lot more complicated. Should we go for it? Should we dive in? Okay, great. All right. And then we'll wrap up. This is actually, oh my God, I gave you so many texts here. I also gave you the Esther colophon. It's just fun. So I keep adding things. This letter is one of the most remarkable documents from the ancient world.
Which document? Let's clarify so everyone's on the right.
Yeah,
Literally.
the second letter that we're about to look at, 2 Maccabees, chapter 1, verse 10 to chapter 2, verse 18. It is, in my opinion, the oldest proof that we have that Hanukkah was associated with fire or a miracle of light. Very often we think, oh, the rabbis made up that miracle of oil because the military story was too militant for them. They suffered so much with all these rebellions, so they just sort of invented this theological story. Well, they didn't, folks, because we are about to see a legend that I think tells us this story is very, very, very old. There's a lot to say, but I'm going to dive right in. All right, again, we have an opening identification of the speaker and the addressee, and we have a very short blessing this time. The people of Jerusalem and of Judea. So again, it's like we're all writing to you, an entire nation of people, just like the first letter. All the people of Judea. It's like if I were to write to my friend Sally in Canada, dear Sally, the people of the United States greet you. It's just very maybe presumptuous, but again, that's why we think that these are leaders here. And the Senate, that would have been the Gerousia, maybe we don't know if that was some kind of precursor to the Sanhedrin or what rabbinic texts later called the Anshe Knesset Gedola, but there was some kind of legal council that that had religious and political authority in Jerusalem. So that's what that means. I'm pretty sure the Greek is Gerousia. And Judas, this would not have been Judah Maccabee, but just some guy named Judah, Yehudah. And they're writing to Aristobulus, who is the family of the anointed priests, teacher of King Ptolemy, so a very well-established Jewish individual. And by the way, we're just writing to all the Jews in Egypt. So this is a public letter, right? Because if I'm writing to my friend Sally, on behalf of all the Jews of the United States, and then I say, and Sally, by the way, I'm also writing to all the Jews of Canada. It's a public letter. It's meant to be recited publicly in front of crowds. This is not a private letter. Most letters in the ancient world were not private. Okay. Aristobulus is a Jew living in Egypt who's the tutor of King Ptolemy, very important position. But the fact that he's a priest is hugely important because already we have a subtext, just like we had the subtext of the first letter. The first letter, oh, we hope you're well. We hope that God opens up your heart to observe his Torah and mitzvot. Here we have, hi, Aristobulus, we're writing to you, priest, because you have a personal stake in the story that we are about to tell, since your ancestors are intimately connected with the affairs of the temple. And this is a story about the temple. And so the next paragraph we're going to skip, it's about how God miraculously killed Antiochus for Epiphanes by having him fall through a trap door, which is very entertaining, but probably highly unhistorical. We have no evidence that Antiochus fell through a trapdoor while going to the temple of Nanaya to have sex with her. But again, this is like one of those Hellenistic legends that would have been very interesting and intriguing, but we don't know that this is actually how Antiochus died. But anyway, there's a paragraph about how Antiochus, he went to the temple of Nanaya to sleep with the goddess, and then you know what happens. Sometimes we just fall through trapdoors. But the whole conception of trapdoors was really interesting to people in the ancient world because it was very easy to put on a play. Imagine a Greek play. So you'd have the stage, then they often made use of trapdoors in their plays. Okay, anyway, it's a little aside. So we're really happy that God struck Antiochus for the fourth down. But in the spirit of our great victory, hold on a second. Oh, I'm not sharing my screen. Maybe I'll share my screen. Okay, hold on a second. In the spirit of that great victory, on the 25th day of Kislev, we are going to celebrate the purification of the temple. We thought it was necessary to notify you so that you may also celebrate the festival of Booths. Again, that awkward naming of the holiday, and the festival of the fire. given when Nehemiah, who built the temple and the altar, offered sacrifices. Now I need to take you to the end of this letter, because this letter is thought to have been written in the late 2nd century BC. And if scholars are correct about that, we could talk about why scholars think that a little later. If scholars are correct that this is a late 2nd century BC letter, then this is generation number 4, right? We've got the event, the war in 160s BC. And the Jews in the diaspora don't really commit to celebrating it for perpetuity. Then we've got the letter that was sent in the days of Demetrius, right, in the 140s, 143 BC, where everything was retold to these Jews in diaspora, and they were asked, please keep a holiday, and nothing happens. Then you got the other letter in the 120s BCE, and again, nothing happens. Now we have this letter in 103 or 102 BCE. So again, we get the sense that Jews in the diaspora, even if they feel deeply committed to their Jewish identity and they even send funds to support the Jerusalem temple, we know that to be true from many texts, and I discussed some of those texts 2 weeks ago, like Cicero. Remember Cicero? Actually, that was last week. But Jews are not apparently celebrating the holiday of Hanukkah. And this is really driving Judean leaders in Jerusalem crazy. So they're going to make an argument for the exceptionalism of Judean authority and the exceptionalism of the land of Israel by making a very brilliant argument. And the argument is that the story of Hanukkah actually has very little to do with the Hasmoneans and with the war that took place in 167 to 164 BCE. The story of Hanukkah affirms a series of miracles that took place at the Temple Mount throughout Jewish history. And the miracles that took place at the Temple Mount impacted the ancestors of all Jews. So even the ancestors of Aristobulus in Egypt. And because these miracles took place in such ancient times that all Jewish ancestors were impacted, that means that all Jews today, in 103 BCE, have to acknowledge these miracles by celebrating Hanukkah. Is that clear? All right, okay, so we're going to tell you the story.
Wait, unpack that again, because I'm reading the text and it's just catching up with my brain. So,
Well, we're going to read the text too.
okay, so you're free. Okay.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's mind blowing.
But again, the way that they're trying to make an argument for Hanukkah is they're saying, look, if we just make it about the Hasmoneans in 167 to 164 BC, then it's just a political event, that maybe God helped the Jews through. So instead, they're going to argue that what happened to the Hasmoneans is the culmination of a series of miracles that took place at the site of the Temple Mount, all the way back to ancient times, and that because these miracles impacted all of the Jews' ancestors, Jews wherever they live have to celebrate Hanukkah to affirm these miracles. Okay, so I'm not going to spend as much time. Sorry. Oh yeah, sure, please.
Are they also trying to bring this to stories that are in the Torah or in the writings of that time?
They are presenting themselves as inheritors of a scriptural tradition by inserting themselves into the scriptural tradition. So I think that's a very good insight. But the story that we're about to read about Nehemiah is not in the Hebrew Bible. So all of these miracles that the writers are about to describe have to do with fire, and they're all miraculous. So the first story, hold on a second. Okay, he says, we want you to celebrate the Festival of Fire, the Festival of Booths and the Festival of Fire, given when was this festival given? Goes back to the days of Nehemiah, who built the temple and the altar and offered sacrifices. So this festival, yeah, it might have something to do with the Hasmoneans. That's the latest miracle God has done there. But it goes back to the days of Nehemiah, the earliest moment, right before the second temple was built. What happened at that time? Well, it actually goes back to 586 BCE, when the Jews' ancestors were being led captive to Persia, that means Babylonia. The priests of that time hid fire from the altar of the first temple that had just come crashing down. It was now smoldering in ashes. And the priests took some of that fire, some of that ash, and they hid it in a dry cistern. And they didn't tell anybody about their location. Many years passed, and Nehemiah, when he's taking the Jews back to the land, let's say this is the 520s, 510s, well, it's not the 510s, it's the 530s or the 520s. He's taking the Jews back to the land of Israel, and he knows that fire had been hidden by the priests 50 years before. So he sends their descendants to go find it. He says to the priests around him, listen, your fathers, your parents, your grandparents hid this fire when they left the land of Israel. You got to go find it. So they do. I guess their parents had told them where it had been. They find the location. But this is all legendary, right? We're not looking at a historical archive. This is the story. And they don't find fire. They find this tar, this viscous, thick liquid. And he says, all right, let's see what we can do with this liquid. Let's put it out on an altar. Let's go to the site of the Temple Mount. And of course, there's symbolism here that we want to build something that's a continuation of the first temple, right? We want to know that God is as pleased with what we're doing now as God was in the time of the first temple. So let's put this viscous liquid on an altar. So that's what they do. They build an altar at the side of the Temple Mount, and they put the liquid on top. And it's a cloudy day, so they're sitting around. They're like, what should we do now? Do we light it? Nehemiah's like, no, don't light it. Just let's see what happens. Over time, the cloud parts. And miracle of miracle, a fire blazes down from heaven and miraculously consumes the sacrifice. There is no sacrifice, right? There's no animal, but somehow miraculously ignites this tar. This is probably the oldest account of a miracle associated with Hanukkah that has to do with fire. And so you have this moment, this miraculous moment that signifies God's pleasure with the people who have returned to the land of Israel. Now you're Aristobulus and you're reading this in 103 BCE, right? And you're like, wait a second. So are they trying to tell me that God is really happy with everyone who came back? But because I haven't come back, I don't get a miracle with viscous liquid being miraculously ignited, right? I mean, that's the implication here, is that God is doing miracles for these people who came back. And so everybody recognizes, oh, there's a really big deal. This is a miracle, right? And the high priest Jonathan leads the people in this prayer. Now, I tend to skip over prayers because sometimes I just assume, oh, they're going to be boring. But prayers are actually where the theology happens. Prayers where you find the real rich ideas. And if you take a look, if you put in the work and you take a look at Jonathan's prayer, it is absolutely bizarre. This is really one of the strangest things. This should be a prayer of thanksgiving, right? God has miraculously ignited this viscous liquid that used to be fire in the time of the first temple. And now this is a sign that God wants them to embark on the building of the temple, and everything's great, everything's happy. And so it should be a prayer of thanksgiving, but it's not. What does he say? Now remember, this is composed by people, I think, in the late 2nd century BC. God, you are awe-inspiring, strong, just, merciful. You alone are bountiful, etc., etc. Accept this sacrifice on behalf of all your people, Israel, and preserve your portion to make it holy and make it holy. Gather together our scattered people. And the Greek there is diaspora. Very rare word in the Second Temple period. Gather together our diaspora, our scattered seeds. Set free those who are slaves among the Gentiles. Now, whether it's 103 BCE or 520 BC, no one's slaves anymore. So this is polemical, right? Because people are no longer slaves. Look on those who are rejected and despised, and let the Gentiles know that you are our God. Again, whether you're looking at this in the time of Nehemiah or in the time of late 2nd century BC, this just does not work historically. Punish those who oppress and are insolent with pride. Cleanse your people in your holy place, as Moses promised. The priests sing the hymns. So what you have here is a prayer of thanksgiving that fantasizes about how Judean leaders in the dawn of the Second Temple period are begging God for this ingathering, or at least to instill in diasporan Jews a longing to return that simply, I think, does not exist, as we'll see next week. In any case, when Jonathan is done with his prayer, a flame blazes up. So it's like miracle number 2, very exciting. And the Persians are so impressed by this miracle that the king declares the site to be a landmark. The implication being, if the king can make the place a landmark and make it a sacred site for the Jews officially, then surely the Jews themselves who live in diaspora can do the same and recognize the unique sacred position of Jerusalem and the temple. That's, again, the subtext here. So it was a really big deal. And the writer goes on that this story, we have this in our records, in our library, the letter writers say, and we actually know from our records that the person who ordered the fire to be hidden at the end of the first temple period was none other than Jeremiah. So it's actually Jeremiah who, after giving the people the Torah, the law, instructed those Jews, oh my gosh, what just happened? Hold on. Those Jews who were being exiled to not forget the commandments of the Lord. It's the same language as the first letter. Remember the first letter? We don't want you to forget the commandments of the Lord. Here we have it again. But here, they know that they don't have enough authority to say it to their cousins, right? So the Judah and his friends in Jerusalem can't say to Aristobulus, don't forget the commandments of the Lord, because that didn't work in the 140s, and it didn't work in the 120s. So instead, they're going to say, we're going to quote to you our ancestors who really wanted you to not forget the commandments of the Lord. We're going to quote Nehemiah, right? And we're going to quote his friend Jonathan, who begged for an ingathering. We're going to quote the prophet Jeremiah, who exhorted 2 generations before Nehemiah, who exhorted the Judahites as they left the land of Israel to not forget the Torah of the Lord, right? It doesn't work for me to say to my sister, don't, I don't know, my sisters are great, I can't say anything bad about them, but like, don't forget to do the laundry. But if I say our great grandmother, I'm just making up a name. Well, actually, I'll just say Molly. I'm named after Molly. Our great grandmother Molly never forgot to do the laundry. Then they might take that a little more seriously. I am bad at analogies. But the point is that they're invoking older generations to make an argument for Judean authority. And what's so interesting about this letter, I'm not gonna spend so much more time on this, but the writers keep pushing this authority back into earlier and earlier periods of Israelite history. So he starts with Nehemiah. Well, first he references the Hasmonean rebellion. Great. He goes back to Nehemiah, the dawn of the Second Temple period. Then he goes back to Jeremiah, the end of the First Temple period. Then, if you could read a letter on your own, he pushes it back to the time of Solomon, where Solomon also offered sacrifices when the temple was dedicated, the first temple was dedicated, and those sacrifices were miraculously accepted. Then he pushes it back to Moses, because guess what? Moses prayed to the Lord and fire came down from heaven. And so you have a series of events in which the greatest leaders of the Jewish people are praying to God, and God is showing his beneficence and his love through the miraculous consumption of sacrifices. And seen through this framework, the Hasmonean rebellion is not a political standalone military victory, but it's the culmination of a series of miracles that God has done for the people who have rightly recognized the centrality of the land of Israel and the Jerusalem. And so we're about to celebrate the purification. We write to you again. Will you please keep the days? It is God who has saved all his people and has returned the inheritance to all, and the kingship and the priesthood and the consecration. It's all here. We have it. We have independence now. This is the time to come back. We have hope in God that he will soon have mercy on us and will gather us from everywhere under heaven into his holy place, where he has rescued us from great evils and has purified this place. Everything that God has ever done for us has told us one thing, and that is that God wants us in the land of Israel. Now, if you can't do that, the least you could do is observe an annual holiday that affirms the exceptionalism of the land. And so here we have, I could go on and on. I could talk about Greek Esther, and I could talk about Ben Sira and Tobit. We have an abundance of Judean literature produced in the land of Israel that is meant for diasporan Jews. And across the board, this literature argues for the centrality of Jerusalem and does so in a way that implies that diasporan Jews are not fully authentic. And there's something missing there, not fully expressing their commitment to the temple even if they are financially supporting. Now we're going to see next week that diasporan Jews do not accept the presumptions and the suppositions of these claims. They embrace their dual loyalty. They are happy to walk that tightrope. They are deeply and genuinely devoted to the land of Israel, but not because they feel guilty for living outside the land, but because they believe that they have a gift to offer their neighbors and that they are ambassadors, right? Just like Isaiah said, light unto the nations, that they have a particular role in the human story. And that role has to do with their ambassadors and their role as representatives of their ancestral teachings to their Greek and Roman. So I'm going to stop there. Are there any questions or comments? Well, thank you.
I have a question open. You can just ask it. That's incredible, Malka. I know I'm still taking it. Question?
Now I'm reading the chat. Why would they need that from Jerusalem? I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
That was very early on about sacrifices, I think.
Well, you can email me. I'll put my email address in the chat again. I know it's a lot to take in. A lot of material. So you know where to find me, and we will have our last class next week.
Quick question. What's the title of your book? I mean, what's the thesis of your, and what's the short thesis of your book? It's not a short book, obviously, but.
So the book is called Letters from Home, The Creation of Diaspora and Jewish Antiquity. And it's available for pre-order on Amazon, but you don't have to order it yet or ever, because it's not available yet. But the argument is that Jews in the land of Israel and diaspora were talking at each other in the ancient world. Because, well, again, I mean, I hope that people read this and see the contemporary resonances. Because diaspora and Jews never accepted fully. I mean, a lot of what I talked about today is in my book. I have a whole chapter on these letters. But the other thing is that they do so by producing literature. Both sides produce literature that speak in one another's voices. So Judeans write texts that fantasize what diaspora and Jews should be feeling, and they associate diaspora with shame. So they produce a lot of texts that imagine diaspora and Jews feeling shame. And diasporan Jews write texts that fantasize about Judean Jews embracing them.
Wow. Exciting. Interesting in each other's voices. Great. Ellen Blank, did you have a question?
Yeah. Did these original, letters and all of whatever you've been able to find documented, did they all refer to God in the masculine tense and as a man? So from ancient times, any talk about God, like in the prayer, talking about God, was that original?
So we do have Lady Wisdom. We have the wisdom tradition, which comes from Greek traditions. That's Sophia. And then in Ben Sira, actually, which I cited a little bit on this document, we have in, I think, chapter 24, an exposition of Lady Wisdom. So we have divine wisdom personified as female. So we have some feminized images of divine wisdom. Some of that you'll also find in the book of Proverbs. I actually wrote an article for the Christian Century on female images of God in the Hebrew Bible. And that article is called "Who is the Mother of God?" Is it called "Who is the Mother of God?" What? That doesn't even make sense. Or something like, just whatever. It's like mother, God is mother. I don't know. I wrote for the Christian Century. And then
Who is the mother of Israel?
There it is. It's like, who's the mother of God? That's like so Christian. Like, why do I keep saying mother of God? I am definitely not Catholic. I just forgot the name of my article. There it is. I'm like embarrassed. It's not a Catholic.
Long day.
Anyway, I also have a podcast. There are a few podcasts on YouTube that talk about images of God as a mother and as a female. And also I would highly recommend Phyllis Tribble's article on this. It's called Depatriarchalizing Biblical Literature. And I think that we do a disservice by assuming that the only image of God is in sort of very male gendered portrayal. But what's interesting, and I know it's late and I know many of you have to go, is that while the Hebrew Bible is very nuanced and playful and fluid when it comes to using different gender images to describe God, right? God is even a nursing mother in Numbers 11. God, and we have that.
Wow.
I know, it's incredible. And also in biblical prophetic literature, we have God as a mother, but it becomes more rigid in the Hellenistic era. So even though we kind of think like, oh, as time goes on, people get more enlightened and more, sensitive or more sort of aware of these things, it's actually not true in the ancient world. These gender stereotypes become much, much more rigid and less playful. So in the Hellenistic era, these things become a little bit more hard. And I don't know of Jewish texts produced in the late Second Temple period that sort of explicitly imagine God as a nursing mother. There's a lot to talk about. So start
Thank
with
you.
that. Let me know what you think.
Great.
Thanks,
See you
everyone.
next week.
Malka,
Thank
thank you
you.
very much. It's absolutely fabulous. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. Good to see you.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.